Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the special council meeting of the 6th of September. We're here in the council chambers and it's 3 p.m. I call attendance in the room today. I believe we have all councillors in persons, myself, Councillor Kunzelman, Councillor Milligan, Councillor Fechner, Councillor Doyle, Councillor Tully, and I believe on Teams we have the other three councillors. Can I just confirm, Councillor Jonik, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Councillor Ireland?
Present.
Thank you. And Deputy Mayor? Are you there, Deputy Mayor?
All aboard.
Thank you. In accordance with Section 254K of the Local Government Regulations 2012 and 8.6.2 of Council's Meeting Procedures Policy, I'd like to move that Councillor Johnny, Councillor Ireland, Councillor and the Deputy Mayor be permitted to participate via audio link. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Kunzelman. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Thank you. It's unanimous in the room here. So thank you, councillors, for joining us. We'll now move on to the acknowledgement of country. Councillor Kunzelman.
Thank you, Mayor. We, Ipswich City Council, acknowledge and recognise the sovereign and human rights of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities of Ipswich to self-determination, meaningful engagement with local government and shared governance and decision-making. We commit through the Indigenous Accord to the strengthening of bonds between Council and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities of Ipswich.
Thank you, Councillor Kunzelman. We'll now go into the opening prayer. Councillor Tully.
Heavenly Father, we seek you to be with us in this meeting today. Assist us to be an example to others, bringing strength and encouragement in whatever we do, and equip us for the ongoing challenges as they arise. Give the guidance to continue to make wise decisions for both the short and long-term benefit of our city and our community, regardless however difficult and unpopular some will be. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Councillor Tully. I have no apologies or leaves of absence unless anyone has any. We go on to item 5, which is the declarations of interest on matters on the agenda. Do we have any declarations of interest?
Yes.
Yes, Councillor Jonik.
In accordance with the Local Government Act of Queensland, Section 150EQ, subsection 4, I would like to inform the meeting that I have the following declarable conflict of interest. So I, Councillor Nicole Jonik, along with other members of my family, hold property in Goodna and have been approached by the applicant, Parmac Property Investments Proprietary Limited, in the past relating to these holdings. I've decided to voluntarily not participate in this decision today.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Jonik. I appreciate you making the declaration of interest. Thank you. Are there any other declarations of interest? No? We'll move on to the item at hand, which is item 6.1, and that is the development application 6610 of 2022 MCU recommendation for Parmac Property Investments Proprietary Limited, fast food premises KFC at Goodna. And the recommendation is that Council resolve to approve development application number 6610/2022 MCU, being a material change of use, business use, fast food premises, subject to conditions as contained in attachment 1 of this report. I will move that. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Fechner. May I ask the relevant council officer to come to the lectern, please?
Good afternoon, Mayor and Councillors. Anthony Bowles, Acting Development Planning Manager.
Councillor Taylor, would you like to ask a few questions first, since you've, I guess, initiated this special meeting? I have some, but I'm happy to ask them later.
I'll just see how it resolves itself, Mayor. I do have a foreshadowed motion.
Right.
And that will probably explain
Okay.
most of the issues. So I'll just see how this pans out.
Would you like to put the foreshadowed motion up now, or you will do it later?
Yes, I can do that now.
Okay, you want to put your
if that's
foreshadowed
appropriate.
motion? Yeah, I think that way the councillors have the full consideration.
Yes, printed it, but I'll have to read it so that people watching this will. It's only 5 pages as opposed to the 51-page report, so it is
So is it rather lengthy, is that what you're saying?
more or less. No,
Okay.
or more rather than less.
Has it been forwarded to the committee secretariat?
Just only about 2 minutes ago.
Okay, I'll wait for Vicky to bring that up.
Would it be easier if I circulate that and people can then follow that?
That would be great, I think, to Sue. But I'm also looking at... Oh, okay. Hard copy? Thank you. For those who are on audio link, so Councillor Allen and the Deputy Mayor, are we able to email it to them, Vicky?
Once it comes through.
Okay. To the committee secretariat or? To Vicky, okay. Okay. Actually, if it may, just because you did call the special meeting, Mr. Osmer, I'll ask you some questions later. I apologise to bring you up
Yep,
now, but I
no
think
problems.
since Councillor Tully did bring the motion forward, I think it'd be fair for him to, I guess, to speak to his views and then do questions. Thank you, Mr. Bowles. Councillor Tully, I invite you to speak.
Thanks, Mayor. This is a foreshadowed motion in relation to the motion that's already been moved,
Thank you.
and it's broken into A and B, but A is the dominant part of the proposal, or the foreshadowed motion. A, that application number 6610/2022/MCU in relation to the property situated at 16 Queen Street, Goodna, received on 8 July 2022 from Parmac Property Investments Proprietary Limited for a material change of use, business use, fast food premises be refused for the following reasons. 1. History of Goodna. Goodna was first recorded as a name by surveyor James Warner in the 1840s and was officially established in 1856 when it was still part of New South Wales and still retained some of its unique local character, 24 kilometres west of the Brisbane CBD and 16 kilometres to the east of the Ipswich CBD. Refusal of this development is the only way this dwelling and its environs can be protected in situ for future generations. 2. History of the site. The property at 16 Queen Street, Goodna, was identified in the Ipswich City Council 1992 heritage study by the University of Queensland as of key heritage significance in the suburb. The importance of the property included the age of the dwelling, circa 1906, combined with its historical social significance within the local area. The dwelling at 16 Queen Street, Goodna, was home for some 4 decades until the 1940s for the well-known Queensland family of John and Mary Carroll. John and Mary had opened and taught at a day school at Redbank Plains from 1874 to 1909. They had 7 sons and 2 daughters, including their second son, Edward John Carroll, who formed the famous national cinematic chain of Birch, Carroll and Coyle, with E.J. Carroll introducing talkie movies to Ipswich, Toowoomba and other parts of Queensland and Australia. The Carroll family home at this location was a major social hub in southeast Queensland during the early decades of the 20th century, with entertainers from the United Kingdom and the United States in attendance over the years. One such entertainer was renowned Scottish singer Sir Harry Lauder, who attended the Carroll family home in July 1925, which was reported in the Brisbane Courier of 27 July 1925. Official recognition of the site. The importance of the building and location is officially recognised A in the Ipswich planning scheme as a pre-1946 dwelling recognised in the scheme as a Schedule 3 listing. B, by virtue of the heritage plaque proposed by the Ipswich City Council Planning and Development Department and erected by Council in 2012 with the consent of the then owner just inside the front boundary of the property, which reads, "This was once the home of Mary Carroll, who purchased the land in 1906. Mary and her husband John Carroll were well known and respected within the community. They opened and taught at a day school at Redbank Plains from 1874 to 1909, where Mary was assistant head teacher and John was the head teacher. Mary and John had 9 children, 7 sons and 2 daughters. Edward John Carroll and Daniel Joseph Carroll were theatrical and cinema managers, and they screened silent films in Ipswich and Brisbane in the early 20th century. Edward joined with G.H. Birch to form Messrs. Birch Carroll and Carroll, which later became Birch, Carroll and Coyle. It was this house that Mrs. Carroll entertained guests of her sons who came from overseas. Harry Lauder, the Scottish coal miner with a glorious voice, was one such guest." And the bottom of the plaque reads, "An initiative of Ipswich City Council, marker number 101. C, by the widespread recognition of the historical importance of the property by the Ipswich City Council and the community, with its inclusion in the council publication Goodna Then and Now in 2003, which identifies the property at 16 Queen Street, Goodna, relating to its age, history and social importance. 4, proposed development of the site. The proposed removal of the dwelling to make way for a gaudy Kentucky Fried Chicken store operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, would make a mockery of the Ipswich planning scheme by placing undue emphasis on the zoning of the property, major centre zone, compared with its major historical significance, when both can be similarly recognised and addressed with the retention of the existing dwelling. Moving the home to Rosewood, some 35 kilometres away, is not an adequate alternative, nor an appropriate recognition of the historical and existing development of this site within the broader Goodna area during the past 166 years. There is strong community opposition to the development, despite the fact that it is code accessible and not advertised in the printed and online newspapers in the local area. When the current application became known to the community, including, for example, in Ipswich News Today on the 21st of July 2022, heading "Locals Reject Heritage Move Bid." Goodna residents say they don't need another KFC, especially one that would come at the expense of a historic home. Timothy Carmichael, who lives 2 houses down from the property, wrote on social media the house was one of the most beautiful homes in the street. Simon Ingram wrote it was ridiculous, damaging to our heritage and completely unnecessary. Another resident, Andrew Murphin, said it made a joke of protecting heritage-listed houses. To me, that includes the site it was originally built on. By moving the house, it has no heritage significance anymore. And that's the conclusion of the quotes from the newspaper. The underlying planning zoning major centre zone does not preclude the adaptive reuse of the building for a wide variety of commercial and or community uses, which would provide proper recognition of the important heritage value of the property in situ, enabling both the heritage value and the zoning of the property to be equally recognised, without sterilising appropriate use of the site for commercial or community purposes. The dwelling is the only remaining property of its era from the early 1900s in Queen Street, Goodna, the main street from the Ipswich motorway south to Alice Street, a distance of almost 600 metres, creating the last opportunity for this only surviving dwelling of its vintage and social significance and the associated site to continue to be recognised and protected as part of the rich heritage of Goodna. Having a plaque installed and or other online recognition of the site, if the building were to be removed and a fast food premises established, would be a travesty of proper recognition of local history for the people of Goodna and the city of Ipswich. 5, traffic and amenity. At 16 Queen Street, Goodna, the external carriageway is a relatively narrow 2-lane road with a narrow verge on each side. This does not permit of a road widening to allow a deceleration lane or left turn lane into or out of the property heading south from the Ipswich motorway, or a separate turning lane into the property heading north coming from the direction of Redbank Plains. Queen Street, Goodna, is one of the busiest suburban roads in the city of Ipswich, excluding main roads, with a traffic count of 18,181 vehicle movements a day, according to the latest official traffic survey by Ipswich City Council in 2021. Notwithstanding the applicant's traffic proposal, the operation of KFC's Redbank and Redbank Plains stores located within major shopping centres demonstrates an excessive amount of vehicular traffic, causing traffic bank-ups on internal roads and interfering with cars attempting to enter and or leave both sites. The proposed store at Goodna fronting Queen Street would bring identical problems onto the main street and would be certain to create traffic chaos in Queen Street, given the way in which the other local KFC stores operate in practice many hours each day. Once the queuing facility within the proposed KFC site is full, traffic on Queen Street would come to a complete standstill, as there is no passing lane in either direction and no physical way to provide one. If northbound traffic were to be banned from entering the site, vehicles would have to travel north to the existing heavily congested Goodna roundabout at the corner of Queen's and Church Streets, with 6 separate traffic legs associated with that roundabout. This would put additional strain on the roundabout, exacerbating existing safety issues in relation to the roundabout, as well as the nearby pedestrian crossing, school crossing at 9 Queen Street, Goodna, which services St Francis Xavier Catholic School at Church Street, Goodna. And paragraph B at the end, that the foregoing reasons constitute Council's reasons for its decision pursuant to section 254H of the Local Government Regulation 2012.
Thank you very much, Councillor Tully. May I ask the relevant council officer to come to the, that's down as a foreshadowed motion. Thank you. Thank you, Mr Bowles.
Good afternoon again, Mayor and Councillors. Anthony Bowles, Acting Development Planning Manager.
Thank you, Mr Bowles. Could you please outline the zoning that is currently in place at the subject site, and what are the overlays and other constraints in play?
Yep. So the property is in the major centre zone. There's also a sub-area, a Queen Street East sub-area for the property. It's also listed in Schedule 3 identified places of interest. That's basically all the overlays, so there's no flooding or other overlays. It's quite simple, the zoning and the Schedule 3 listing.
So what does a major centre zone mean?
Look, it's actually fairly brief in the planning scheme. I can read you that directly. The major centres, from its name, is intended to provide commercial centres, commercial activities, commercial uses. In this particular major centre zone, the code states that, sorry, I'll just get back up again. So there's 2 sections. There's for the Goodna Major Centre itself, and then the sub-area. The overall vision for the Goodna Centre is stated as follows. The overall vision: capitalising on its strategic location and high-quality public transport linkages to Ipswich and Brisbane, the Goodna Centre will be transformed into an exemplar of transit-oriented development. It goes on to say that contemporary subtropical architecture and high-quality public realm, including a new town square and a vibrant array of new uses, will ensure an attractive and thriving sustainable place. Going down to the sub-area zone intent, I'll just get to that. So this is the secondary business area, Queen Street sub-area. It supports the primary business area, and uses and works include retailing, commercial, community uses and recreational entertainment activities with opportunities for residential uses above the ground floor.
Okay.
So principally the zone is intended for retailing and commercial activities supporting the principal centre in the town in Goodna.
How long has the Goodna Commercial Centre classification been in place, and can you tell us when and how it was originally brought in?
Just from my quick review, I understand it to have come into place in 2004 with the planning scheme. However, there's been quite a few planning schemes before the 2004 planning schemes. There would have been an expansion of the centre over time. There has been some amendments to the Goodna town major centre zone. Predominantly in 2007, there was an amendment to align the terminology in the zone to align with the South East Queensland Regional Plan. There were further amendments to locations within the zone in 2012, including the area behind this property in the character mixed use sub-area, as well as some amendments in 2007 to Schedule 2, which is a higher level of heritage protection in a few properties in Goodna as well. So there have been, over time, some incremental changes to town centre, but nothing major other than the introduction of the 2007 amendments to align with the South East Queensland Regional Plan.
Okay. Look, I understand there's a heritage overlay over the site. What level of classification has the site been given?
So the property is listed in Schedule 3, which is identified places of interest. So it isn't a character zone or a local heritage listing or a listing on the State Heritage Register. It's a specific type of listing that we have in Ipswich City Council. In terms of what that means or what the intent for Schedule 3 is that these places of interest are located in an area where the stated planning expectation is that the land could be developed at a significantly higher intensity than offered by the existing building. So that's one of the statements about Schedule 3 is that the property of interest or the building is identified, but it's also not necessarily required to be retained in situ. So I made reference a minute ago about the character mixed-use sub-area, and that's a sub-area we have across the city, but there are individual sub-areas, including one in Goodna, sub-area 17, which talks about retaining character houses and using them for, retain them in situ and using for them commercial uses as well. Okay. So we do have a zone that's specific for using a existing character dwelling or character building for commercial uses, commercial reuse. So, and that has been something that has been applied to the properties behind this one.
So when was the heritage classification considered and applied?
April 2004, I understand.
2004? Okay.
Again, the Schedule 3 and the Schedule 2 are more contemporary versions or parts of the current planning scheme framework that we have. So character protection in planning schemes varies from different councils. So Brisbane City Council has a demolition control precinct, for example. There's outside of individual local planning scheme provisions, there's a State Heritage Register and local heritage registers. So our Schedule 2-3 system is something that Ipswich City Council has.
Okay. I know with the foreshadowed motion, Councillor talks about a heritage study that was done by the University of Queensland in 1992. Mm-hmm. So are you aware of why the house hasn't been considered for higher protection under Council's heritage protections or within the state government's Queensland Heritage Register?
It comes in basically amalgam of those two provisions that we talked about. The desire for the Goodna Town Centre, major centre, to have commercial uses near the town centre, near the train station as a larger transit-oriented development, as well as the part of the Schedule 3 which identifies that those homes or those locations can be removed when the sub-area allows for those uses. So when you combine them together, you get a picture where we've done a planning study, we've identified the places of interest, we've also identified that we have an underlying desire for commercial uses in this locality, therefore we've allowed this particular property to be relocated rather than retained in situ. Behind this property in other areas in the city, we take a different stance where we say, no, we want to retain these properties and we want commercial activities to occur in this building. And that's what we've done with the commercial mixed-use zone behind this property.
Okay. So is there anything stopping the owners from removing or relocating the house right now? I mean, would they require council approval if they wanted to move it today or tomorrow or something?
So a Schedule 3 listed property, it's exempt development to relocate a building. There may be a permit required if the house has been moved to a location that has other overlays or a character overlay. The planning scheme states that ideally the building is relocated within the local area, but it doesn't require that. It does allow it to be relocated within the local government area.
So does that mean it doesn't require a permit? They could do it, they could move it, but where they put the house would require a permit or permission from council? That's
right. It's not necessarily required. So, for example, if it was moving to a place that had no other constraints and was in the low density area rather than character area, it could be relocated there without a permit.
And the owner could do that at any time now without council permission?
That's correct.
Okay. Would the owner be allowed to demolish the building? Or would they need a council permission to do that?
That would be more difficult. So, yeah, the ability to relocate would be exempt, but demolishing would require an application.
Council permission?
Yeah.
Okay. Would we be able to can council condition that if we were to relocate that it stays in Goodna?
I think that would be difficult. it's not a assessment benchmark other than it's really that requirement or that outcome is a note in the planning scheme that says, ideally. It isn't, say, for example, a specific outcome that says it should be. It isn't a strong case for a condition. We can certainly encourage it, but because the planning scheme also states that it's possible to move it within the local government area, they would already, moving it to the proposed location already complies with that note on its own. So I think it would be a difficult condition to place on. Okay.
Is there another way that we as a council could recognise the heritage of that site and that building?
We've proposed a condition to provide some more information or essentially update the current heritage marker to include information about the new location of or the new proposed location of the dwelling, and there's some information that we could provide on the site that identifies that yes, this site is significant and this dwelling was here at this time, however it has been relocated. That is one thing we've put in as a draft condition. I'd be open to other ideas, but I think that's a fairly consistent way of managing a scenario where a building has either been demolished or lost for other reasons or relocated. Certainly it's a common outcome that you'd see. We've already got a marker on the site, and certainly that we've recognised the significance of the site, as mentioned already, and we could include more information on that, but that would probably be about as much as we could do, I'd say.
Okay. There was discussions also in the foreshadowed motion about traffic, and I know the report speaks to it, but could you speak to, it is a very busy street, Queen Street?
It is. It is also a street where we've identified major centres activity to occur, centres uses to occur, commercial uses and things like that. So the applicant has submitted traffic reports that demonstrate that the use will not have a significant impact on the road network any more than what should be expected for a use of this type in this zone. So there are also some planned upgrades to, I believe, the capacity upgrades to the roundabout. I think we mentioned that in the report, actually. Down in Alice and Queen Streets. So there will be some improvements to the vehicle movements in that location in terms of the capacity upgrade, but the applicant has demonstrated sufficiently that the proposal complies with the planning scheme in that respect.
Okay. Are there any potential legal consequences for council if councils decide to refuse the application today?
I would say the main consequence would be a potential appeal for council in the Planning and Environment Court. So an appeal against our decision, seeking to overturn it.
Right. And how much does that normally cost?
It really depends on the ability to negotiate or the level of disagreement about the proposal. So anything between officer time and officer solicitors to hundreds and thousands to millions of dollars. But on a matter of this scale, you could be looking at something between $200,000 to $700,000. Okay. By comparison, appeals that result in a significant disagreement on a policy level can be protracted because you need a significant amount of experts, and you could be looking at that higher end, 500,000 legal costs. So yeah, it can be significant.
And in your opinion, if it was appealed, what do you think based on your experience, what would happen?
In my opinion, I think there would be difficulty in putting up a strong defence because of the clear statements in the planning scheme about allowing a property such as this Schedule 3 property to be relocated within the local government area, and the use complying essentially with all the assessment benchmarks that are relevant to what we're talking about as far as a refusal today. So I think there'd be great difficulty in defending that appeal.
Okay. Sorry for so many questions, just that it is a very unusual situation. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think Councillor Doyle, I think your hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Bowles, just in relation to the property behind, you said was zoned commercial mixed use, I think with a character overlay?
Character mixed use.
Sorry. Can I understand the difference between the building on that property and the building in question here?
It's actually more than one property. It's a whole street essentially. So okay. We'll be talking about all the properties. I'm just going to get my map up. On Church Street, numbers 17 to 29, 6A and 6 are actually Schedule 2 listed. The other properties are a mix of, I would say, pre-46 dwellings and more contemporary dwellings. Looking at the, just quickly, we've got, I would say, 5 pre-46 dwellings and a couple of contemporary ones. I don't believe they have the same level of cultural significance. They probably, I'd say more likely that they possess architectural features that are of value. So they're more character dwellings rather than dwellings that have had an important person or a notable person living there. So that's the main difference. I would say they're not quite as old as the building we're looking at today, just from my architectural knowledge. So the main difference there is that they are to be retained in situ.
Yeah. I'm just trying to wrap my head around why this property, if we accept, and I understand we've only just been presented with a lot of this history from Councillor Tully this afternoon, but if we accept that it is correct information, how is it that a property pre-1946 and with such, I guess, important cultural history, how is it not a Schedule 2?
Fundamentally, it comes down to the conflicting priorities between retaining a character building and developing a substantial commercial centre. So if you look at the planning scheme, there's a note in the planning scheme which identifies the level of intensity that the goodness centre is intended to have capacity for. We're talking something in the order of, I think, 950,000 square metres of GFA. Let me just get that up. So substantial centre conflicts with character dwellings. And that's a conundrum that will happen in any city with these types of dwellings. So a decision would have been made at some point that for that particular strip, the priority is the major centre. The strip behind it, the priority is retention of the remaining character.
Okay.
It would have been a difficult decision, but on the basis of what the planning scheme does say for this property, that's what I would deduce.
And I just want to confirm, and I think Mayor Harding's already asked this question, but today, if we did not accept the recommendation, that property could be removed still at any point.
That's correct.
And the ultimate way to protect the property would be a temporary local planning instrument. Is that correct?
The time machine would be the best one, to be honest, would be to have listed it ahead of time.
Yeah.
So there have been a few reviews of the character zone in this locality where we have identified new places to put in the Schedule 2 and chosen not to put this one in. Temporary local planning instrument would be one option. That is something that other councils have utilised. I've written some myself, actually, so that is one option. The fact that it can be removed so quickly without an application is the troubling part. So a lot of the times a temporary local instrument would be useful if there was to be an application lodge which provides a buffer of time. We don't have the benefit of that in this scenario. It's a possibility, but there are tests for TLPIs. You have to demonstrate that there's a risk of social harm occurring or environmental harm. So
I have been led to believe, and it may be incorrect, that there is an agreement for somebody to purchase the property and have it removed. I mean, obviously, this application is still before council, but obviously the property owner may have been planning ahead if this was successful. How does that sit, I guess if we look at the sequence of events?
So there is a proposal for the property or the dwelling to be moved to Rosewood. There isn't actually an application required for that because it actually goes into a character area in Rosewood. However, if there was another property that didn't require that application, it would just be a matter of getting the capability, having the vehicles, the labourers available to pick up and move the buildings. So the real restriction on that is availability of those sorts of resources. And then there's the process of drafting, having a council resolution, and then going and getting the state's agreement to the TLPI for that to come into effect. So there's a competing, it's a bit of a race, really.
And if there is an obligation under a written contract between the property owner and a purchaser of that property, that house for removal, that's a completely separate obligation outside arrangements with council or an application currently before council.
That's right. That isn't part of, those sort of contractual arrangements aren't part of our assessment. We're purely at the moment looking at the fast food outlet, and whilst the removal of the dwelling is something that can occur, it isn't fundamentally tied to this. That is something that can happen separately.
Yeah.
And there will be potentially a separate application that does deal with that in its new location.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Tully, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mayor. I'll just read a section of your report, if you want to turn to it, but it's just on page 10. There's two issues there. It says, note 11.3.3a of the Character Places Overlay Code also identifies that the planning scheme encourages the conservation of identified places of interest, but doesn't make it mandatory in situ, but it encourages it. And then the next paragraph on that same page says, it is noted within the above reference code that, and there are three possibilities. Where possible, Schedule 3 buildings should be retained on site in a manner which also retains or enhances their streetscape presence. So that's listed as the first alternative. And I assume in descending order, for order of preference, it says, alternatively, such buildings should be relocated as close as possible to the original site and oriented and restored as far as possible to retain or enhance their original streetscape presence and overall setting, or be relocated within a character zone, which is what is proposed. But do you see those reading 11.3.3a, which is what I first mentioned about the preference or encouragement of retaining the houses, a house in situ, and then you move down to the other two possibilities, that in a planning scheme, that the first stated preference or encouragement should be the one that would be first looked at?
I would generally agree if we were looking at a scenario where those were listed as assessment benchmarks. The trouble with the current planning scheme, in particular in this matter, is that what we're looking at are notes to the table of assessment. So they aren't listed as assessment benchmarks in the character code. They're preferences, but they aren't specified outcomes that we're required to achieve. However, they are obviously listed in order. They're identifying a preference with that, as you state, that retention in situ is the preference. And I would agree that that would be the preference. However, it doesn't preclude the other options, and the code doesn't require us to achieve that preference order.
So where it says where possible it should be retained on site, that's stated as the first preference or possibility.
It is the first preference, but as I said, not in the code itself, in the table of assessment, which is also where it states that it's exempt development.
I understand that. In the report, it says that the applicant had sought other possible places to relocate. Let's assume that we skip over the preference or the possibility of retaining it on site. Had you looked at the following three properties, 37 Queen Street, which has a very wide frontage and is very close to this. These three properties are within 100 metres or 120 metres of number 16 Queen Street. 37 Queen Street, which is vacant, which is a very large block that goes through to William Street. 15 Church Street, Goodna, which backs onto Queen Street, Goodna, and is a very large block. And the property behind, 19A Church Street, Goodna, which is directly behind this block, which is a vacant block of land. Had you looked at those three to see if it was possible to relocate, not suggesting it's a preferred option, but that any of those three was genuinely an alternative option?
I suppose the issue with that is we might be able to observe that those properties are vacant, but whether they're available to the applicant to be purchased is not part of the assessment of the application. It's not something we can consider. I can't confirm whether the applicant approached those owners or considered those properties. I'd have to take that question on notice. But as far as our assessment as council officers, we did not look or seek to find other vacant properties as alternatives for the property to be relocated in Goodna. And the basis for that is simply that the planning scheme allows for another alternative, and particularly if one has been proposed by the applicant, where we can guarantee that the outcome is still being achieved that the planning scheme says. So in summary, we're not able to assume that an applicant has access to land that isn't currently part of the application. So we didn't review those particular properties.
Thanks, Mr. Bowles. I just want to revisit one aspect that we've been discussing this afternoon in terms of the zoning. Is major centre zoning inherently in conflict with Schedule 2 listings, or are those two things actually able to exist at the same time? So I'm trying to understand whether, council historically could have moved this property into a Schedule 2 listing rather than leave it as a Schedule 3 and still be in that major centre zone.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it can coexist. It is possible. It comes down to, I suppose, the intensity of the centre and the ability for the building to be reused. So we do actually have a couple of Schedule 2 listed properties. We've got one across the road and at number, I think it's, oh geez, it's small, 33, and it's 6, which is a few blocks down, a few properties down. There's also one on the Roundabout near the town centre. So there are a few. And a lot of places have similar provisions requiring adaptive reuse of buildings near a centre or within a centre. There does become a limit to how capable you are of achieving your GFA goals. If you protect all the buildings, for example, and you have a goal of 950,000 square metres of GFA, yet the buildings are only 300 square metres each, and you've got 12 of them, for example, it becomes a limit to how capable you are. But there's certainly scope in some circumstances to retain them and also build around them. For example, we currently have proposals that we're assessing in the Ipswich CBD that build around existing Schedule 2 dwellings. So it's possible to coexist, but there becomes a natural limit depending on how large the planning scheme identifies the centre is intended to be.
Thank you, Councillor Fitt. Any other questions of Mr. Bowles? No? Yes, Councillor.
Chair, if I may, just with regard, Mr. Bowles, with regards to the traffic assessment, it's being observed that future upgrade at the intersection, I just lost my place in the report there, just south of the
Alice and
development
Queen,
site, Alice and Queen, is that right?
Yep.
A capacity enhancement there, is it being assessed that will provide for the high volume of traffic moving in and out of the site?
I don't think it will directly be relevant to the site itself. It would be the capacity for Queen Street and all the streets coming off that intersection itself. It's relevant in that there is intended works in that location that it will improve the capacity of the network, but directly related to vehicles coming in and out of the site, it's probably less relevant in that regard.
Right. And so I would assume a traffic report provided by the proposed development has stated that there is capacity on site to handle queuing.
That's right. Well, it complies with the planning scheme in that respect. So it's just also worth keeping in mind that experiences with KFC in other locations is, whilst relevant in considering what we're looking at now, that we're actually assessing a fast food tenancy. It is possible to be a Zambaro. It is possible to be another one,
Yeah,
Taco Bell.
yeah.
So,
A different brand.
you know, queuing is certainly a consideration and can be an impact, but as far as complying with the planning scheme, that's been achieved.
And in some instances with queuing, it's more driver behaviour, and that's not able to be conditioned by planning.
That's right. There's a limit to what we can do.
Just in relation to that, it wouldn't just be driver behaviour, it'd be driver volumes in a lower socio-economic area where many people would be wanting to access the site compared with some other suburbs.
That might be the case. Unfortunately, that isn't part of our assessment in terms of the socio-economics or the demographics of the area.
I understand that. I'm just talking about the realities of it.
Councillor Ireland, I think you were wanting to ask something?
I didn't want to ask, I'm just making a statement that I think that the traffic, although the report says it's going to be managed, if you happen to go down that road towards the railway line or the highway, at any time, if there's cars reversing out of that shopping centre area near the pedestrian crossing, it just queues all the traffic now right back to the lights up at the hotel. So I'm really concerned. We have the same problem at the Redbank Plains Shopping Centre, and in my opinion, there's already a traffic problem in that area.
Thank you, Councillor Ireland. Are there any other questions of Mr Bowles? No, thank you very much, Mr Bowles.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, sorry, Mr Bowles, I had one more question. My apologies. Sorry. Councillor Tully, we're talking about on page 10, the character places overlay code and others. You made the comment they are not assessment benchmarks. Does that have a legal implication for us or not?
It does. Assessment benchmark is the important part of the planning scheme that we're able to base decisions on. Notes have changed status over the various planning regimes under the Integrated Planning Act, then transitioning to the Sustainable Planning Act, and now the current Planning Act. Notes have been refined in their ability to direct the assessment. As far as considering the note in an assessment table of assessment, it's a long way away from the code, the assessment benchmarks, unfortunately. They really, what you want to avoid in a planning scheme is having a scenario where you're carrying out the assessment in the part of the planning scheme which tells you what level of assessment you are in the first place. Because then you come into a scenario where we're talking about things about preferences for the way the development should be carried out, yet at the same time we're saying we don't want to see an application at all, or even a self-assessment, for example. So it's unfortunately just the way a lot of planning schemes are written at the introduction of the Integrated Planning Act is that a lot of things, these ideas were put in places that potentially probably wasn't the best place for it. Ideally, the better place for these sort of criteria would be in an assessment benchmark, in a code.
Okay. Thank you, Mr Bowles. Thank you. I'll open up for discussion. Yes, Councillor.
Thanks, Mayor. Having foreshadowed the other motion in the event that this motion is lost, I will speak against the adoption of the motion which has been moved. To put this into perspective, there are two key issues which are arising in this case. One is the zoning of the major centres zone, and I guess it would be fair to say the conflict between that and the listing in Schedule 3, which does to a significant extent identify the importance of that property in relation to the word I'll use broadly, heritage and related issues. I think Mr Bowles used the expression, which is 100% right, the conflicting priorities. Now, they are clearly conflicting, and it's one of those issues as to what preference this council should place on those conflicting priorities. Can I say that the report in that vein concentrates more on the importance of the zoning and what may be done there rather than the Schedule 3 listing. The Schedule 3 listing in itself and the zoning don't prevent the use of this property for commercial or community uses. In other words, as reflected in the foreshadowed motion, it is quite possible for the zoning to be protected, the zoning to be used for commercial or community uses to be established there, and the retention of the building, which is what the community seems to want and which I believe is the preferred outcome. Both the zoning and the Schedule 3 listing can be equally recognised. And I think that's a very important consideration. It's not necessarily one or the other. Let me say that the house is pre-1946. It was built in circa 1906. It's 116 years old. It has a very rich history in terms of the age of the building itself, but also in relation to the visitors to the site, the building and social significance of that precinct. And it's the only house of its era remaining in Queen Street between the Ipswich motorway and Alice Street near the Cecil Hotel. A KFC can never replace that history. I think it's important, very important, that we put our hands up to recognise the history of the area. Councillors who are there know the intimate feeling of the community, and I don't believe a house would be removed in very quick time, because the commercial value of the building, if an alternative use was to be sought, would be more likely if that property was retained there. This building itself would, this dwelling house, would have in my view, have the richest history of any house in the Goodna area, given the significance of it back to the 1900s and for several decades beyond that. I do acknowledge the issue with the code, but at the end of the day, as specified on page 10 of the report, the character places overlay also identifies that the planning scheme encourages the conservation of identified places of interest, that is Schedule 3 places, that it encourages it. Then it goes on to specify a note within the code in descending order about where possible, Schedule 3 buildings should be retained on site. Now, this is a Schedule 3 building. It can be retained on site and should be retained on site. And then it goes down to two other possibilities. I just remain concerned that the fact that the suggestion that just because it's a note in the code that it should be or could be disregarded, and that's my words, but it seems as if a note in the code which is very specific, where possible, Schedule 3 buildings should be retained on site in a manner which also retains or enhances their streetscape presence. We can have, on behalf of the community, the best of both worlds. We can recognise and must recognise the current zoning as in the major centre zone, which enables a wide variety of commercial and community uses on this particular site. We're not sterilising the property. We're saying that the importance of the character or the listing under Schedule 3 is so important in this particular case. This is not any old building in Goodna. This is in the main street of Goodna, and I strongly support the retention of the dwelling. I have no objection to the redevelopment of the site that's appropriate, that retains the building, but for it to be taken away and moved to Rosewood, I find that quite unacceptable, and that's why I'm not able to support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Doyle. Councillor Doyle?
Thank you, Mayor. This is obviously a difficult one for the entire group, and especially for myself, given my role on the Queensland Heritage Council. I am really frustrated and upset that here we are today and we're hearing about, the rich history. Why wasn't it placed on the Schedule 2? There was ample opportunity since 2004 if the property, and I'm not debating, I'm not, the importance it carries, but really, really upset that it's been overlooked for all these years. The days of reactive measures to afford a character property protection are over, in my view. This council, this group of elected reps made it a strategic priority that we get our new planning scheme underway. As part of that, we know we need to do an audit of our heritage stock around Ipswich. There are gaps. I find it really, really upsetting that on the one hand, we have a great reputation for looking after some heritage properties within our LGA, and yet there's gaps like this along the way. I am concerned that there is no legal basis to council conditioning and approval. And Councillor Tully, help me shift that view. But at the moment, I am not hearing there is a legal basis that we can condition it based on a note within the planning scheme. And I'll just finish by saying, and I've been talking about this a little bit lately, raised several times the concern that there's quite a few other examples of character homes that are just, slipping through and they're not afforded the protection that they need. I don't understand why this one wasn't protected via a TLPI. Nothing else.
Thank you, Councillor Doyle. Any other discussion? I'll just note that Councillor Cornsmore, Councillor Councillor Fickner.
Thanks, Mayor. Putting aside the nature of the business being proposed, the situation at the heart of this matter is that Council has made, historically, two policy decisions. One is that the land is to be a part of future commercial centre for Goodna. The land was never intended to remain for low-density residential living. The zoning has been commercial since 2006. And I guess as a broad designation as well, you see it in the current 2017 Shaping South East Queensland as a regional activity centre. And that was the case in the 2009 iteration of the same regional planning document. And the second is that Council made a decision to recognise the site as an identified place of interest, not a character place. In 1999, there was the Eastern Corridor Structure Plan, which was when the planning scheme provision was to protect heritage, when that came into consideration. The site was listed as a property and the owners were specifically written to. Since 2004, it's only been known as a place of interest, not a character place. These are long-standing council positions, decades long. In our decision-making and the structure of the planning scheme, there has to be hierarchy and order of consideration that needs to be contemplated. And this needs to form the basis of our decision-making this afternoon. That is, the site will be used for business or commercial use at some stage. The Schedule 3 listing cannot dictate a future use, as Councillor Doyle said. Our scheme says so. The scheme encourages the conservation of identified places of interest, but does not compel the conservation or retention in situ, as we've discussed ad nauseum this afternoon. If we as policymakers want to review this, we can, but we should not do so ad hoc. It should be methodical, well placed, and as part of the considerations for our brand new planning scheme. As Anthony stated earlier, Schedule 2 zoning and major centre zonings can coexist. This has historically been the case. This could have been resolved in planning schemes or amendments in years gone by, but unfortunately that is not the reality we are facing this afternoon. The best of both worlds seems to have been a missed opportunity. Officers have followed the scheme. They have followed Council's policy provisions, providing advice to residents, businesses and developers over the years. Proponents and owners of sites have made decisions based on advice from Council's planning department and staff. There is no planning reason or basis to make a policy change at this time or on this particular one site. Our officers have clearly shown that in the report. The application has been assessed against the codes in the scheme, and council, in my opinion, is obliged to approve. To do so without justifiable planning reasons exposes council to potential legal challenge, an appeal, and further undue costs on our ratepayers. And we've spent a lot of money in the P&E court in the last 2.5 years, forking out money to lawyers on behalf of our ratepayers. So I see that as a huge risk here as well. So I speak in favour of the officer's recommendations for those reasons.
Thank you, Councillor Fechner. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to this? No? I'll close up and summon before we go to the vote. Look, this has obviously been a really difficult decision for us as councillors. We are rightly very proud of our heritage and character places here in Ipswich. Our city over many years has taken great steps to preserve and conserve places of importance for our community, demonstrated by the thousands of places listed and preserved across our city in our heritage register. But while I understand the heritage arguments for this particular site, it has not been recognised or listed as a character site under our heritage provisions, which have existed now for more than 30 years. The Goodna Major Centre Zone has also been in place for 18 years, a product of the previous council's push to expand commercial activity in our city and to leverage Goodna's strategic location on the Ipswich motorway and proximity to the Logan motorway. And as Councillor Fechner said, this was reconfirmed in 2017 with the Shaping South East Queensland Regional Plan, which I think, Councillor Tully, you were the acting mayor at the time, and made Goodna that major regional centre. Our heritage is important and something we cannot take for granted. However, this place, if it was going to be protected as a higher order heritage site, should have been considered and protected in the 30 years prior to today. We can and should preserve the house itself. That's very important. And the proponent has indicated a willingness and plan to move the house to a character precinct in Rosewood, where it will add to the streetscape and be seen in context with similar houses. Councillors also need to consider the potential legal costs and reputational implications in rejecting considered opinion from our professional planners. I actually don't think a refusal today will deliver the outcome that I think you're after, Councillor Tully. It can be moved at any time. The owners could move it tomorrow regardless of what is decided today. And then they can just resubmit an MCU again. While our residents expect us to listen and act on public sentiment, they also expect us to act prudently and with respect to the independent professional staff who provide us with recommendations to consider. I acknowledge that we as a council have rejected advice from officers before, and there'll be occasions where we will need to do that again. I also acknowledge that council has proactively engaged in very expensive legal action to defend its decisions in the Planning and Environment Court. However, councillors, we will need to all think carefully about the ramifications for us outside this meeting in terms of defending potential legal action and the impact on confidence in our planning approvals process. With that, I'll put the matter to the vote. Those in favour, please raise your hand. That's myself, Councillor Cornswell, Councillor Willigan, Councillor Fechner. Those against, it's Councillor Tully. How do you vote, Councillor Ireland, Councillor Madsen?
I'll vote against.
Against, thank you. Councillor Madsen?
Sorry, I'll vote against, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Abstaining? That's abstaining. So that makes it essentially a tie, and I have the casting vote, so I vote to approve this. Thank you.
Mayor, just before we close, I think it would be proper for me to say that I'll now be taking the matter to the Queensland Heritage Council for consideration as a separate level of assessment by them. Thank you.
I understand. Thank you. So that matter was approved as passed, and the meeting is now closed at 4:04 p.m. Thank you.